This is a gun made entirely from wood, and it's been constructed by combining modern technology and engineering principles with traditional craft techniques inspired by medieval weaponry. And I'm about to fire it for the first time. This stupid idea started when Mark Rober released his video on a one-piece Nerf gun blaster and made the plans publicly available for people to print themselves.
Amazing. I love that.
While it is very cool, the problem is that it doesn't generate very much power at this scale, and my 3D printer doesn't have the capacity to print anything larger. Hence the decision to make a full-size version entirely from wood. So we got off to a bad start straight away after realising I couldn't just convert the 3D files to a 2D draft that I could create the plans from. So I used my photocopier to create a parallel scan of the gun that could be imported into AutoCAD and traced around. So this is my screen. This is V1. How do we plan on cutting this out, I hear you ask? Well, let me introduce you to our new toy. This is a new laser cutter that we've been having a lot of fun with over the past few weeks and was provided to us by xTool. But rather than do a whole sales pitch on this thing, I'm just going to let it speak for itself throughout this project. But if you are interested, there's a link below.
Yeah, go for it. Oh?
No way, is that?
Oh.
But, hang on.
That's got some force.
This was looking very promising, and so we decided to test things further by doubling the thickness, adding a barrel, and allow for a further draw, which certainly added some tension.
Oh, I can't actually go. I can feel it. Let go.
Oh, wow. With the initial testing complete, next I engraved a full-scale template of the gun. This gave me something full-sized I could scribble over to figure out how to actually make this thing from wood, because while the overall design is very similar to Mark's, the construction had to be completely adapted to be made from wood. Here's a piece of wood where the grain is going up the length of it, and as you can see, it's pretty damn strong. And here's a piece of wood where the grain is going across its width. This is called short grain, and if we fail to consider this when making the gun from wood, it's going to be absolutely littered with it. So prototype 1, well I think it's actually 5 by this point. I've got a lot further than I thought I would with just developing it on CAD. So fingers crossed my confidence there translates to what's going to be produced on here. So we're now entering the design development stage where we'll slowly iterate the gun and figure out the weak points before making the final design. The overall design and feel of the gun came out looking pretty good, but the trigger was designed very poorly and broke almost straight away, and there wasn't enough clearance for a full draw. Version 6?
I think it is 6, yeah.
Version 6 included a slightly improved trigger design and fancy texturing on the grips, but I forgot to change the lock point on the trigger, meaning it still wasn't able to fully draw, which was then fixed on version 7. This is starting to look how I envisioned it. We've got a decent draw on the gun, the hatch pattern is much finer and closer resembles the checking patterns you see on gun stocks, and the trigger itself has been redesigned to be much cleaner and has a built-in stop that prevents you from being able to snap it. Kind of. Okay, so it's just occurred to me that while I may have strengthened the trigger pull, it can still be broken from excessive side pressure. And I've also noticed the frame is slightly flexing under pressure, and so we're going to need something to tie this area together. Sounds like a fix for version 8. This version now includes a cage design that adds rigidity to the structure of the gun, the trigger is enclosed to prevent damage from side pressure, and we've increased the draw by another 5mm. Does it cock? Ooh. Oh. Okay. That didn't feel very nice.
No, but it was the first time, so you got...
Oh yeah?
Yeah. So loosen off a little bit.
Pull it. Version 9 was all about reducing friction. I sanded all the inside faces to 240 grit and applied a layer of wax to help things slide smoothly against one another. Oh god. And I also put washers between the layers to prevent the internal mechanisms rubbing on the outer layers. So I think we're entering the realm of diminishing returns with this gun. So let's assess where we're at. These prototypes are currently being made from plywood, which is fine and all, but it doesn't give us the best representation of how this will perform when it's made from solid wood. For two reasons. Plywood is constructed from alternating layers of wood, thus making a board strong in all directions. And so even if you have a piece that appears to be short grain on the face, it will still be strengthened by a piece of long grain underneath. However, because the final gun is going to be made from solid wood, it's only going to have grain running in one direction. And so even though this plywood prototype feels pretty strong, it could be a completely different story when it comes to solid wood. Secondly, these fins that store the tension would ideally have grain running up the length of them, because that's the direction in which wood is the most flexible. However, because of the fact it's plywood, the layers underneath have grain running in the opposite direction, which makes them incredibly fragile. And not only that, but it's going to be subtracting from the overall amount of tension that we can store. So by this point, I don't think we're left with any other option but to begin making this from solid wood. I'm actually quite stuck with this. I know for a fact that I want to use this big bit of walnut for the outside of the gun. Then as for the mechanism on the inside, including all of this springiness and the tension holding aspects of it, I want to use yew. The primary reason for this is this stuff used to be used to make longbows because it's very good at holding tension, and as long as you cut it with the grain, it's very resistant to splitting in some ways, but it's mainly due to its flexibility. So that gets us started with brown and orange, which in my opinion creates a really nice contrast, and also because neither of these are exotic woods, they're somewhat understated at the same time. The bits I need to figure out still are these grips and sort of textured bits on the outside. This is lacewood, or otherwise known as London plane. And in fact, these are the trees that you see growing all throughout cities. They've got that kind of flaky bark. But what I love about this stuff is when you cut it in a certain orientation, it looks stunning. And we're kind of getting glimpses of that all the way up the length of this piece. I mean, look at that. Look at it on the edge. I didn't even spot this when I was buying it. Like, that is such an amazing pattern. To machine the components for this gun, we're going to need some really thin components that my machinery is not able to produce. But I knew for a fact that just up the road from me, an old friend was sat not being used, and I think it was about time I called in to say hi.
Why are we back in college?
This is Rycottwood Furniture Centre, where I trained for 5 years. In fact, if you go back to my earlier videos, this is where they were filmed. But the reason for my visit was to use this. Right. See if I can remember how to use this. This is a drum sander and is exactly what I need for this project. The way it works is by feeding material through a conveyor belt, which is then fed under 2 sanding belts, which both reduce the thickness of the material and sand it perfectly smooth. I've used this countless times over the years, and you will have seen it in many of my videos, such as my Rubo Workbench series and my bass guitar series, but I must say I never quite envisioned using it to create a gun. We got one spare because I forgot to put it through. Back to the workshop. With the walnut down to 6mm, we could now start cutting out the gun, but not before doing a little bit of testing.
You're right.
Yeah, mate, I'm great.
You sure? Ooh.
It's actually a really nice finish. With the testing a success, the gun could now be cut.
Well, I thought I'd probably go.
I'm a bit scared about this.
I genuinely can't.
Boom!
Will that sound now?
It's out. Oh, I just got pins and needles over my whole body.
So why were you looking for the walnut veneer?
There's lots of short grain in these layers going this way. So we're basically going to make walnut plywood using veneer to basically have the grain going upwards between each of these layers.
Nice.
Yeah.
Looks tasty.
Oh, thank you. I know I do.
No,
Yeah.
you're wood.
In addition to adding strength, I was also going to be using this veneer to act as a spacer between the layers to cut down on friction with the internal mechanisms, which was a much better alternative to the washers that we used during the prototyping phase. So we used the laser cutter to cut the locator holes for the gun into the veneer, which would allow me to pass an M4 bolt through all 3 layers and ensure that the outer layers stayed in line with one another.
God, it's so freaking bendy.
Once that had dried, I trimmed away the excess and used the same technique to adhere another layer of veneer to either side.
Yes.
So while those internal layers are gluing up, I'm going to turn my attention to these outer layers because we've got a bit of work to do here as well. Most notably, these ribs going across this outside skin. I wasn't able to cut them out of this outside layer in one go because again, it would result in short grain across the ribs here where the grain would be going in this direction. Just to reiterate, the problem with this is that it's incredibly weak. So what we're going to do instead is join some strips of wood going vertically where the grain runs this direction so that we can make the most of long grain strength. There is no way that is breaking. As you can imagine, this was a fairly involved process, and so I didn't have much time for talking. But if you want to learn how to cut dovetails yourself or use veneer in the way that it was intended to be used, check out this new project we've just released on the Free Online Woodworking School YouTube channel, where we're making this shaker table from start to finish.
Okay, so Matt's just made a noise, which suggested I needed to get up to see this.
The dovetails aren't in yet, but they're cut. They're half laps.
Okay, okay.
They're tiny.
They're quite nice.
Oh, hang on.
Yeah. Ooh!
Yeah. The next day, the internal layers had all finished gluing up, and so I got to work cutting away all the excess material and cleaning up the inside, and then once that was done, I could begin cutting out the sockets. I traced around each of the tails with a marking knife, which you can purchase from my store by the way, and then drilled and chiseled out the waste. I was in a really good flow of this until...
You bloody idiot! You bloody... How long have you been working on this? I just saw you drop that. Did you capture it on that camera? No. You've done some really nice dovetails and now you've gone and done that.
It's fine, this was just a small blip in the timeline of making this gun and was easily repairable, but it does go to show just how fragile this thing is. Anyway, I continued cracking on with the dovetails, got them all glued up, sanded to fill any minor gaps, and then set them aside in preparation for later. So with these internal layers glued up, we have now reached the point in which we can start constructing the tension spring mechanism to go in here. And to help me with this stage, I have made this, or I've got the laser cutter to make this. This is called a rod, and as you can see, it is a 1-to-1 scale, so I can put the Nerf gun over it and use this drawing to help me size all of the components required to make up this awkward shape. This is quite a common technique to construct awkward shaped pieces of furniture. In fact, I did it in the first ever series I did on YouTube, and I also did it in the Japanese picnic bench series as well. Those involved lots of curved components all intersecting with one another, and the only way to measure it was by drawing something like this. But of course, back then I had to draw it by hand. Now I can just cut it on the laser. So it's pretty simple how it works. I'm just going to label each of these components. Then we can simply put one of the components over the rod, get it lined up with the end here, then put a knife mark where we want to cut it. And I know that this is a 10-degree angle, so I've just got to draw a rough line on there to show me which way to cut that. I can also use this to set up my sliding bevel. We made sure to cut this line on the laser cutter as well, so that is now lined up to 10 degrees. So with that mark I did on the bottom, if I just square that up to the top and then use my sliding bevel, square that along the top, I know that is now component A. If we just stick that on there, line it up with the end, you can see that that knife line lines up perfectly with the rod. We didn't have to do any weird measurements, including these angles. So I'm going to go through that process with the rest of the components. And the nice thing about this as well is we can use this to align the fins that are the sort of things that hold the tension in this gun. Once all the components had been cut to size, I began making a jig that could be used to create the bridle joints that connects the inner spine of the tension mechanism together. 9 times out of 10, I'd cut these by hand, but that dovetailing really took it out of me earlier, so I let the router table do the hard work for me this time. Once everything was assembled, I covered the rod in a layer of wax because I was about to take a bit of a gamble and use it as an alignment board for gluing the internal spine together. Right, fingers crossed this isn't stuck. Yes! Fingers crossed this can hold itself under tension because I've never done something like this before. So I got to work cleaning everything up and added the trigger catch. Then I began cutting the slots for the thin components and sanded each rib to fit perfectly. For this I made myself a little sanding jig that would give me the correct angle, then used the rod to get the perfect length. Sorry for the bad audio, I can't be asked to set up my microphone, but like honestly, that looks so good. I was prepared for this to be an utter nightmare to clean up after gluing, so I pre-waxed all the components with the exception of the gluing faces, then got them stuck in position with epoxy. Once dried, I came back with some coarse sandpaper to flush everything off before removing all of the excess glue. I could then begin attaching this to the pullback ring where I decided to use a through mortise and tenon. This was relatively simple to make as all it required was a notch to be cut on both sides of the ring, which then sandwiched the spine between. Pins were used to keep everything aligned, and then before I knew it, the internal mechanism was assembled and just needed to be cleaned up. But that's going to be a job for later because next we need to work on the trigger, which will make use of the flexibility of U once again. I lapped the U into the top of the trigger and then glued it into position within the body of the gun. Once dried, I could then file away the underside of the U to give it the perfect amount of flexibility. Then once that was in position, I could glue the tension mechanism into place with some epoxy. So we're now at the point where this gun is ready to be glued up. Everything in the internal layers is in position and pre-finished. The inner faces of the outside components are pre-sanded, pre-finished, and I'm satisfied the trigger is working as intended. So here we go. With everything glued up, we're now officially on the home run with just a few bits to finish up before testing to see if this thing actually works. I started by cleaning up all the outside faces using my various sanding machines and applied the first layer of finish. And while that was drying, I began creating the grips from lacewood. I've been having a lot of fun with stabilising wood recently, and so decided to carry out this process on the grips to add a bit of durability to them. I've got a video on this coming out soon, so I'll gloss over the process for now, but suffice to say, this turned out to be a terrible idea. Refusing to give up, we scored the outline of the grips into the lacewood and I shaped them very carefully by hand. Black epoxy was then poured into the logo to make it stand out against the highly figured material and then was sanded away after hardening. Finally, the last step was to pillow, sand and finish the grips in preparation for assembly. We were now ready to get this thing together. This is a gun made entirely from wood, and it's been constructed by combining modern technology and engineering principles with traditional craft techniques inspired by medieval weaponry. And I'm about to fire it for the first time. I know, I'm sorry, we genuinely hoped this thing would work, but clearly didn't put enough testing into it. That said, I've already got a huge list of things I'd do differently if we were to try it again, and so if this video gets 10,000 likes, we'll give it another crack. But if you want to see what happened after this heartbreaking moment, check out the extended cut here, and as always, thank you very much for watching.